2 days ago, we were up in Whangarei, in the middle of that storm. We were inside, fortunately. We were running a classroom session for Ngātiwai. And we had about 15, 20 of their young people with us, both some of their people from the school where we were running the classroom session. And as we went through the day, some of the young folks were being picked up by their parents and taken home. Some of the older students hadn't arrived because of that huge storm. They were at Whangaruru and just unable to get to the session. But we could look out the window and watch the waters rising, outside. So we got home. State Highway flooded on the way home, just behind us on the way home, but we got home safely. About 5 days ago, I received a video clip, and it was from a trail camera, and it was from Puketu Forest. That's inland from Kerikeri. And the camera was there for, I'm not quite sure why it was filming fern, but it was a rare fern, so it was filming that patch of fern, maybe for browse or something. But this petrel walks in, and it's a black petrel, taiko. Now, it's at a time of the year when, we do get fallout from birds. Chicks leave their colonies like Cook's petrels, titi, or black petrels. But that's in April, May, those sort of months. And you get that in Auckland. You get that, well, you'd probably get it here. But yeah, this one was interesting. So Cam talked about, the spread of birds through the country earlier. And it's possible that there are still remnants hanging on in these places, Puketu Forest, up on these bluffs there. So that was interesting. Anyway, I'll get on to what I'm here to do, is to talk about seabirds. As Joe said, we're the Northern New Zealand Seabird Trust, or charitable trust, actually. But yeah, everyone just kept on calling us the Seabird Trust. At the same time, there is the Southern Seabird Trust, who work mostly with bycatch, work with fisheries, looking at mitigation measures, and doing a lot of boat ramp work up here in the north, talking to recreational fishers about, mitigating against catching birds. Our focus is pretty much doing research on islands. We do research at sea, education engagement, and advocacy, which is, what we've been doing a lot of lately throughout Auckland region, but also the Waikato and Northland as well. Let's start with the global picture. Aotearoa is the World Centre for Seabird Diversity. We are an archipelago stuck, as you well know, down in the Southern Ocean. And that is a perfect place for seabirds of all kinds. We have the greatest diversity of petrels, shearwaters, albatrosses, penguins, and shags in the world. We also have the highest number of globally threatened species, and that map there in the centre is, about birds that are globally threatened. So look at that dark patch there, okay? So here's some numbers. There are there's over 11,000 bird species in the world. There are 400 species of seabirds in the world. Now, some of those populations are quite numerous. Some of them are very small. But you think of the world as being, 60, 70% ocean? Only 400 species throughout the world. Now, we have a quarter of those breeding here in New Zealand, and at least a third, possibly higher, of all those species turning up in our EEZ throughout the years. 36 of those breed nowhere else in the world. They're endemics to New Zealand. Now, the country of the next highest endemicity is Mexico, and has 5. Now, that's a number worth remembering. We also have more native seabirds, that's birds that breed here, than all our land, freshwater, and shorebirds combined. That's about 87 species out of the total number of natives. Now, in northern, some of you would have seen this poster. It's there's still some there to be handed out. They're free. Please take one. We don't want to take them back on the plane tomorrow. There are 28 species that breed in northern Aotea. The big guy on the bottom left breeds up on the Three Kings. The rest down the northern coast and in the Hauraki Gulf. And off those, 5 breed nowhere else in the world. So, we're up with Mexico as the second highest country with endemics. Now, for a number of years, I used to take bird watching trips out in the Gulf. And, as we cruised out from Seabird or Gulf Harbour or Whangarei, we would, take the chart, put it on the deck or on a table, and start talking about the islands and their importance for seabirds. Well, as you know, black petrels, world's population here on Aotea, also on Hauturu, maybe Puketi Forest, maybe, I don't know. 98% of the world's population of Cook's petrels, TT, breed on Hauturu, good number on Aotea. And New Zealand storm petrel. This is Hauturu is the only place where these birds are known to breed, and I'll come back to that bird later on. And our rarest bird, Taraiti, the New Zealand fairy tern, breeds on beaches like Waipu, Mangawhai, Pakari. There's a few on the west coast on the Kaipara South Head. Go a little bit further, taking some of the other islands, outside our immediate surround. This is Picross petrel, looks like Cook's petrel, very, very similar, very hard to tell apart at sea. However, they only breed in the Hauraki Gulf. They breed on the Chickens or Maratiri Islands and on the Mercury Islands. Rako, Bullish Shearwaters. The only place in the world they breed is on the Poor Knights. There have been the occasional one pair turning up, say on one of the Chicken Islands on Maratiri Island, Lady Alice. But that is where the population is. Hoi, grey-faced petrels. Northern New Zealand is, that's where these birds are. They're endemic to our northern region of Aotearoa. They breed on the west coast. Most of them are on the east coast. Biggest population is on Whale Island of Whakatane. And these are flesh-footed shearwaters, Tawanui, again on the Maratiri or Chicken Islands, but also on the Mercury Islands as well. And there are a few in the islands in the Cook Strait. Well, I hope you're sort of getting the sense that this part of the world is very important for seabirds. We've got some very special birds here. Right now, I'm going to focus on this group of islands. And it was great to hear Fletcher talking before about their priorities and prioritizing the mokahinas, also Rakitu, but I'll come back to Rakitu later. And the reason for focusing on the mokahinas is, they're sort of a bunch of really interesting islands. They're in the outer Hauraki Gulf. They had rats eradicated first on the Western Islands in 1990 and then on Whanau Island in 1997. It was the first group of islands which was subject to aerial bait traps. And it was successful. At the time, there would have been about maybe 3 species of petrels or shearwaters breeding on the island. There were oi, definitely. There might have been some fluttering shearwaters, pakaha. But birds were trying to breed. It's just Kiori there. But the islands were pretty devoid of seabirds. And part of the reason for highlighting this is it's sort of like an introduction to Izzy's talk as well, because as Joe said, some of her work was based on those islands. Well, this is a view from top of Burgess Island, Pokehino. Looking back to Aotea, you can see the Needles in the distance, but you're looking across Funnel, Murray Rocks there, and then bulk of Aotea in the distance. This is dawn. I should say that this is actually from the loo, but it's a great view. At night, this is when things really rank up. And a lot of the work that we do with petrels and shearwaters and storm petrels or whatever is working at height. And, we use a hut that's up on the top of the island, quite close to the lighthouse, and the island's spread out below. And a lot of the work is on these slopes. The big light in the background is a cruise ship. And basically, sometimes the cruise ships are going from Bay of Islands to Auckland, and they sort of fudge it a little bit, and they don't move. They go out of Bay of Islands, and the next day they turn up in Auckland, But they sit out there, these bright lights blazing away. And, I mentioned before about birds turning up, being attracted to lights, being attracted to Auckland. And, we're starting to see Cook's petrels turning up, in the streets of Auckland when these chicks leave to depart their colonies and head out to sea, but are bedazzled by these lights and are sucked in. There was a bad case of a cruise ship where it came through like that at a time when Bull's shearwaters and freshwater shearwaters were fledging. Something like 129 birds ended up on the decks. Unfortunately, the crew put them all into boxes. The birds fought. A good number of them died. A good number of them survived. But it was a bit of a mess and a horrible thing for Doc to have to sort of tidy up. But the work on the Mokihinau's nighttime. These are oi coming in, landing. You have a lot of calls happening at night. And, these guys have their name, oi, is based on their call. But they also have this sort of squeaky wheel call as well, which they have when they're flying. And these birds come through not long after dark and start heading towards their burrows. A bit later on, in come these little storm petrels. And the numbers out there are phenomenal. There was an island where they had been breeding. The moment the rats were gone from the island, they colonized Burgess Island. They're just in the tussocks there, in amongst the Muhlenbeckia, just under vegetation and tiny little burrows. Okay. But probably the most numerous bird is this guy, Guaca, diving petrel. It'll be the subject of Izzy's talk. So, there's thousands of them out there. Absolutely gorgeous little bird, about the size of, fits in your palm of your hand. Yeah. Quite shit. There's also Korora, quite a few penguins out there. And one of the things we would like to be doing is comparing how those birds out there are faring compared to what's happening in the inner Gulf, because we're seeing a lot of die-off amongst Korora around the inner Gulf, around either on the mainland or on some of the islands there, and particularly young birds, being dying and starving. But working at night, you can be sitting there, you can be sitting in the vegetation, you've got a bird, you're sort of banding it, measuring it, taking blood samples or whatever, looking at taking diet samples. But you hear these sort of noises in the vegetation behind you, and then you look around and shine your light, and sure enough, there's one of these guys sitting there. There are 7 species of reptiles on Burgess Island alone, Some of the other islands, it's just phenomenal, the amount of reptile life out there, which wouldn't have been there when, the rats were there. There's one track we we worked on the northern part of the island, and because it's down through Molenbeek, and because we were heading up there every day, every night, we had this track. And if you went down there during the day on a nice day like we have here, you'd see this river of skinks going down, these Montahina skinks. Yeah, it was amazing. The weather can also do this. This is the outer Gulf. It would have been like this the other day. This is looking back. The lighthouse is just over here. This is looking south, looking down into what's called Crater Bay. And it's wild. It gets very wild out there. Well, all too often it's, doom and gloom when we're talking about seabirds. So I'm going to start with some good news. And there is good news. The three species, New Zealand storm petrel. Okay, it was known only from 3 specimens up until 2003. The specimens were collected at sea, 2 in the early 1800s. The last one was in 1895. And they reside in 2 are in Paris, in the museum in Paris, and 1 with the British Museum at Tring in the UK. Now, these birds, sat there. They were described in various publications. They were described in the book on New Zealand birds by Oliver. But and he was the one who coined the name New Zealand storm petrel. But scientists looked at it and thought, well, it's possibly related to something like a Wilson storm petrel, which is very common. And But anyway, it was in 2003. It was photographed off the Coromandel, off the Tianga, and there was a lot of debate about what it was. It was thought maybe it was this, and this. And then a guy, a paleontologist who has been working with fossil birds, went, hold on, maybe it's this one. And sure enough, looking at the photographs, looking at that, so there was a pretty good chance it was going to be the New Zealand storm petrel, as same as those specimens. But it took another several years before it was captured at sea using a net gun. And blood samples were taken and compared, DNA was compared to the specimens in the museums, and sure enough, it was the same species as those birds. Then it became, well, where do these birds breed? And so we did a big effort in 2012. We wanted to find out the timing of when they were breeding. And to our surprise, they were breeding much later. We went and captured, I think, about 20 birds at sea. And we looked at a lot of these birds, they develop a brood patch, when they're incubating an egg. And the brood patch has different stages. And by those stages, you can work out exactly when those birds, what their breeding timetable is. And it turned out these birds don't lay their eggs until about the end of February or March, which is ridiculous compared to all the other birds breeding in the Gulf. They're way out of kilter. So that's when we focused. The next step was go and catch them, put radio tags on them, and sure enough, we managed to track them to Hauturu. And then on one amazing night, some intrepid took 2 guys, a team of 4, managed to pick up a stationary signal from one of these transmitters and had to drop into a chasm, a sort of a canyon, and climb up through the forest. And sure enough, here underneath some kiki was the signal, and they could take the aerial off, pull the receiver over the kiki, and say that's where the bird is. And sure enough, a few days later, we all sort of descended on this patch and found the bird and followed its progress. Chick was hatched, and we were able to follow that as well. Since then, we've been able to find just 5 burrows, natural burrows of these birds. We've been trying to set up an artificial colony using playback, and I can talk a little bit about that shortly, to try and get them to nest in nest boxes so we can study them further. But so far, it's been unsuccessful. We get a lot of eggs laid, but we don't get fertile eggs, which could indicate immature birds that we're attracting rather than mature birds. So, but one of the things we did was to do a population survey based on two things. We were capturing birds, we were putting colour bands on them, we could identify them by going out at sea and photographing, spotting them, and doing counts. But we could also go onto Hauturu and use a floodlight and count the number of birds going through the floodlight. Some of those birds, good number of those birds captured. In fact, since 2013, we've captured over 600 New Zealand storm petrels. But those early days, you can see the numbers down the bottom. We went back in 2023 and turned out that it was Cyclone Gabriel turned up, and that was the end of that survey, and we were trying to get back again. But you can see the difference between the numbers at the bottom and the numbers in that very short period at the top. We want to continue the survey or repeat the survey and get an accurate number. But what we're seeing is that when you go out to sea, the numbers of birds numbers in New Zealand storm petrels you see out to sea have increased dramatically. We were doing a project catching black petrels at sea as part of the work here, trying to get a population estimate on black petrels. We were capturing at sea. We did 2 years of that. You'd go out chum, we'd use net guns. We caught over 600 black petrels. At the same time, out the back of the boat you could see 100 New Zealand storm petrels, something never happened way back in 2003, 2004. You rarely saw a bird out there. So that's the good news. We know they're increasing. How successfully they're breeding? We need to find out, and how the population has gone. That's something we need to confirm. Well, the other good news is the population of Aotea Ecofest has hovered around 35 to 40 birds, total population of that species in the world. It's our rarest bird. Now, in recent years, the Department of Conservation has led a recovery project, have done an enormous amount working with environmental groups, NGOs, but also a lot of volunteers. And they've added to that an artificial breeding program where they're taking eggs from nests and taking them into Auckland Zoo. The birds, the eggs have been incubated and they hatch, and then after a period of artificially feeding, they release them back into the wild. But they do it in stages. And the good news is that, the population may get to 50. There's problems. I mean, the good thing about terns is they can have a second clutch. So you take one egg away, the birds will go and have another clutch. So you've got this this little group of wild chicks a little bit later on. So you're adding the artificial raised ones to the wild ones. Unfortunately, some of the wild ones are still getting predated. Mm. But they have had a successful season, and these birds have been reported turning up at the Kaipara. They most of them breed on the east coast, but they do cross over to the Kaipara once they finish breeding, and they spend that winter period over there in those inlets. Obviously, there's some nice prey there for them. The other good news is around restoration work, and Tawhanui, just over there on the other side of the Gulf, is a good example of this. Back in 2009, it was a bit earlier, back in 2007, we had an inkling that there were oi somewhere there. Fishermen were talking about hearing these weird noises coming from the headland. And it was either birds going into burrows or just flying around, or birds maybe interested in breeding there. Well, in 2009, we found the first breeding pair, the first chick. Tawhanui is a long peninsula, 6 out into the Gulf. It's fenced off at one end. It's not perfect in terms of being predator-free, but it's as close as we can get. There's a lot of pest control taking place within it. But it's pretty damn good. You do get incursions occasionally from cats, maybe from stoats and so on. You're lucky you don't have stoats here. So in 2012, we installed some playback systems. Now, the idea of a playback system is you're playing calls. You're basically telling these birds, look, there's a colony here. Come and suss it out. And we're playing a bunch of mixed calls. So we've got recordings from the mokahinas where you get these multiple species there. And what we were getting at Tawhanui were not just one species, not just target species. We're getting 2 species. Within 6 months of the sound system going, and kawaka were breeding there. Straight in. Shortly afterwards, fluttering shearwaters are showing interest. That's the guy in the middle. For some reason, they just love the sound. It's ice cream to them. In 2024, this is a Cook's petrel that was found breeding on the south coast. Interesting enough, it was away from where the speaker systems were, but it's the first record on the mainland of a Cook's petrel or titi in historic times. So yeah, good news. Not so good news. It's around pelagic fish schools. And yeah, you look at that picture, it's Kauai, it's Trevally. You can see that scattering through there, that's krill. That's what the fish are feeding on. But you can see how attractive that would be to fisheries, and the purseine fishery in particular. They basically, the numbers of these fish schools have deteriorated in the Northland, outer Hauraki Gulf area. They're still there. You still go out to the mokahinas, you'll still see these fish schools. You'll see them off North Thirst Reef. You'll see them at other places like Horn Rock or whatever. But the numbers have diminished. And when you look at the catch rate of the purseine fishery for that area, it's just gone like this. To the extent that the purseine fishery no longer fishes in the Northland Hauraki Gulf area. There's nothing to stop them going back. And in fact, spotter planes, which they use, have been spotted circling around looking. But the bulk of their activity is in the Bay of Plenty off the Coromandel. So that's what one of those fish schools looks like underwater. And I envy you guys with your wonderful underwater camera. I was just looking at that and thinking, oh, this was all taken with GoPros, just throwing a set of GoPros into the water in front of a fish school and you get this sort of image. But just imagine one of those lovely... Topside, it can look like this. And, Cam showed a very similar photograph. This is prawns and shearwaters feeding over one of the schools, Trevally and Kabawai. Occasionally you get kingfish or a shark coming up underneath and bang, so this happens. It's noisy, it's smelly, it smells of fish, it smells of birds, and it's an amazing sight. We don't want to lose that. Purseine is very effective. It's an old photograph, but it's one of the only ones I can find, actually. The vessel is a new one. I've just superimposed that, but it's a Tauranga-based vessel. But that's the technique. It just runs rings around these fish schools, literally. The net is run by a small boat and set around the fish school, and then it's just pulled together like a purse. Now, the fishing vessels and the skippers are drawn to them by these spotter planes they send out. And they just roam the area. They just do grids. And that information, when they spot a fish school, these pilots are amazing in terms of, accurately, one, knowing what species they are within these fish schools, but also the size and the possible catch size that they're going to get from it. So the skippers and the managers we'll go with that one. However, it's a little bit indiscriminate, and you're out. You've got a boat out there. You want to go and catch something, so they might be taking other things which aren't target species. And there's a lot of talk about stuff being dumped and so on. So, our concern is that this is happening. It's a lot of this fish is being exported. What are we losing? We're losing those fish schools. We're losing that association, and that's the subject of our graphic over there. Is we're losing that association, which is critical for some seabirds that key times within their breeding cycles. So, bad news. Fisheries bycatch still happens. It's flesh-footed shearwaters are the bird most at risk. Certainly there have been great advances in mitigation, and thank you to, DOC and MPI and everyone, and southern seabirds getting on board with this and reducing it within New Zealand waters. But these birds are migratory. So they're out in, the high seas. They're going off in terms of black petrels, they're going off to, Ecuadorian waters when they're not breeding. Flesh-footed shearwaters, they fly to the North Pacific. They can be up around Japan for part of their migration, go across to California and then come back that way. So they're risk from fisheries outside our area. So there's a lot of work being done by, MPI, DOC people, trying to, advocate broader than just within New Zealand. But the work being done in New Zealand has been good. Marine heatwaves, and Izzy's going to talk about that shortly. But we are seeing increasing storm events, sedimentation, the combination making for increased turbidity and so on. It's having an effect on diving species like Kora, and that's one of the birds that's been heavily impacted by these storm events. Being unable, they're visual feeders underwater. They're trying to detect their prey. They can't find it. And the young birds in their first life, the first few months at sea, are just being hammered. They just starve. They just can't find prey. And the bottom one, the spot and shag, we're down to maybe a few hundred of these birds. We're seeing birds being caught in set nets, and mainly within the Firth of Thames, and that population continues to decline. So we're going to look at two familiar species. Both of these are visual foragers. Now, gannets, you're familiar with gannets. That site happens out in the Gulf. These birds, they cruise along, they, spy prey. They can be quite low to the surface and spy prey and go down. But quite often they circle up and scan for activity. It could be a workup or something. But then they start diving in this spectacular fashion. It's amazing. But they require water that's has good clarity, if you like. They can see their prey, and they can see the prey quite deep, because these birds they'll hit the water, but they'll continue to fly underwater and chase that prey, and don't always just hit it straight away. But to do that, you've got to be able to see it and see it clearly. Now, interesting thing is, this was work led by Nigel Adams back in 2018, that we continued with him in 2019, 2020, comparing the diet of birds between Hora Hora Rock, which is just north of Waiheke, with Mahoki. Everyone knows where that is. And just looking at the diet of these birds. Now, gannets are quite fun. I wouldn't say fun, but they regurgitate their prey quite easily, and you can get excellent samples from them. You only do it through a small group, but it was enough to show that the birds on the inner Gulf had a very much inshore, near-shore type prey. The ones further out were feeding on much more pelagic species at a much greater diversity. And that pattern continued through all the 3 years of the study. So, with gannets, what we found were there were diet differences between those two colonies. But what we also found, because we were tracking the birds, was that the birds from Mahoki and the birds from Hora Hora Rock were actually dividing up the Gulf. There was an overlap just south of Kauai. But the Mahoki birds rarely went into the inner Gulf. They went north. They went out beyond out here, outside the barrier. But then there was almost like an invisible boundary further north. And of course, on the Mokihinas, there's another gannet colony, and on the Pornites, yet another gannet colony. So basically, these birds are dividing up the ocean between colonies. We also found that individuals would repeat, go back to the same place. They had a special place. I'm going back there because I know there's food, sort of thing. And of course, you've got a big colony down on White Island, Wakari. And again, you've got, this is important for these birds in this area. Also, there were aerial surveys done of gannets throughout northern New Zealand. In 1980, we did one in 2017 for all the colonies, all the way up to Three Kings, down the west coast, and then looked at the population differences. And what was happening was that Mahoki, the population was going up went up 130% in that time. The ones on the inner Gulf Islands, Hora Hora Rock was one, went down 60%. The ones that there's some gannet colonies just outside Coromandel, the township, those ones had gone down 50%. So the birds, and that's the advantage of being a surface nester. You're not anchored to a burrow or a colony in the same way that burrowing seabirds are. You're able to shift. And that's what we're seeing. Are the birds following the food? Is there better food further out? Are there changes in prey availability? Or is something else happening in the inner Gulf, which is making it harder for them to find prey? Now, this is Tara, white-fronted terns. It's a beautiful bird, but we're sort of seeing the numbers. There is a concern that the numbers are diminishing in the north. And what's going on? And yet, the inner Gulf, with all its turbidity, its poor, sediment-laden waters, is actually the stronghold for the species within our region. Now, why is that? Flying across yesterday, forget the bits of stuff that was on there. Barrier air need to clean their windows. But this is Waiheke, obviously, flying across to, yesterday afternoon. And, after that rain event, so those huge rains, this is sediment that was coming out of Waiheke. And what we didn't really see or appreciate until we got a bit further out was the sediment-laden water that was coming out of the Waitemata was phenomenal. And that sort of snuck out under here. But you can see the difference, So you've got water that has low visibility, and yet Tara. This area is the stronghold for Tara within our region, and yet gannets are moving out of that region. I had to include this. This is as we came across the Coal Channel. Is that Jackson's Bay up there? Anyway, it just the amount of sediment that was coming out of the Coromandel itself, out of the Firth of Thames, and mix it, with the current systems there, was just incredible. But the answer comes down to what prey these birds are feeding on. One wonderful thing about Tara is that if you want to do a study diet on a diet study on Tara, is that you just go and photograph what they're carrying in their bills when they're coming in to feed their chicks, or when they're displaying with their mates. Pipefish. The one at the top is sort of like an anchovy. It's a bit more like a pilchardy size. They take a lot of anchovies. Down the bottom, there's actually a juvenile barracuda that was photographed in Otago. But these fish are close to the surface. In other words, that murky water is actually presenting the fish on a plate. They can pick them off. I mean, pipefish, you go out and you'll see them jumping out of the water like that. So easy prey for a tern. A seabird colony can look like this. This is Rako, Bullis shearwaters on the poor nights. We have a T-shirt that describes Rako, and it's a whole bunch of birds, and it's got a lot of words on it, and it says, Rako are loud. That noise is they make an incredible din with all those birds. But just think of, the islands, the poor nights aren't just covered like that. They're in patches on the island. They're these little like sub-colonies, if you like. They're very dense. A lot of burrows underground, a lot of noise. You see, that would have been taken earlier in the season when the birds are socializing, coming back. So you get a lot of birds up the ground. But just think of, the fertilization that goes on that, Cam showed us before, that amount of poop. Of course, the birds are going into burrows, some chicks are dying, some birds are, they're regurgitating, all sorts of crap, if you like, ends up going into the ground. And this is the graphic that we have down below, which shows, this cycle that goes on. So the birds are feeding out at sea. They can be feeding, way out at sea, or they can be feeding quite close to shore. They are breeding in burrows, but they're also breeding on the surface. And that guano finds its way into the system, into the ecosystem, that terrestrial ecosystem. It basically fuels everything. And the bush birds benefit, the invertebrates benefit. It's a phenomenal process, but it doesn't stop there. And rain events like we had 2 days ago on the poor nights would have seen waterfalls pouring off the island. And all those nutrients are just pouring into the nearshore environment. So you're getting increased nutrient runoff around these seabird islands. And that, of course, fuels the kelp forests, which, of course, provides greater diversity underwater. And, of course, the birds feed on that, that diversity, and the cycle continues. This was a study that was done comparing the kelp around, the algae around islands that had never had predators on, and islands where predators have been removed. And it showed that basically there was an increase in that, the seaweed, the diversity of those islands in the time since that eradications. Good. So let's change tack again. These are islands with great potential. Aotea, the work that's been done here by all you groups is just phenomenal. And it's great to hear it. It's great to see what's been done. Looking forward to it being maybe more coordinated in the future, but that'd be, it takes time. But we look at somewhere like Motukaikura, again, the idea that Kiwi are going to be taken back to that island, that's amazing. That's great work. I've included Rakitu, which I'll come back to in a minute, but I've included Kuvia Island. Now, rats were eradicated from Kuvia. Kuvia is just, you drive up the road go towards Pitchford, and you look back and you see it sitting out there. It will have an influence over what happens here on Aotea to some extent. Because rats were eradicated in 1993, and it's going gangbusters. It's, okay, there's been a translocation of Pycroft shearwaters there, which are doing really well, but the island is drawing in other species, which are also doing well. And we're going to be doing a survey out there later on this year just to see how well things happen. But the Mercury Islands down not far to the south of there is that source population. And these islands here are going to benefit from that in the future. And again, that's Kuvia Island, just and looking at the dock staff doing some banding work out there. It's done each year. They're just checking the development and the progress of that population. Rakitu. It has enormous potential. It's a big island. It's great to hear it's being, again, another group or another island that's being prioritized. As Fletcher said, rats were eradicated in 2018. There's a lot of, there's been the translocation of Tiaki. We're hearing about a reforestation. That's excellent. We did 2 acoustic surveys prior to the eradication, and we looked at the species that were trying to breed on the island. We were monitoring one small population of oi, which never had chicks. They were trying to breed. Adults can put up with a lot. They can put up with rats. They can put up with even weka. But the chicks can't. So the chicks, we never found any chicks fledging from the small colony on the western side of Rakitu. We did pick up other birds, and there's on the south coast of Rakitu, there's a little stack called Close Island. It's close. And on it, we could, we knew there were diving petrels. we did some listening from the southern coast of Rakatu. We could hear fluttering shearwaters, Pākehā out there. After the eradication, we did another acoustic survey. This is putting a bunch of recorders around the island, and we detected still oi in several locations, but also Pākehā. And to our surprise, we picked up a little guy up here, the Tutarori, the little shearwaters. And the reason why that was a bit of a surprise is because the nearest colony is most likely the Mercuries. Maybe these birds have been trying to breed all this time, and finally they were almost getting their chance to settle. But we need to go back and do another survey to see, to confirm that. And of course, Rakatu has enormous potential, and from Fletcher's presentation this morning, that is being identified. The idea of taking invertebrates back, taking tuatara back, is amazing. But how successful that is, and he implied that there was a barrier, and the barrier, of course, is these guys. So that's the question. If they stay, Rakatu is a weka refuge. It'll have limited scope for restoration, for broader diversity. But of course, weka are a threatened species. And, I think these birds, most of them, the gene pool suggests that they came from East Cape, from the East Coast. Maybe they should go back there. Maybe it's a debate that's ongoing. I mean, I like weka. My son's got a place down in Greymouth and just sort of Cobden. And, you see weka running across, little families of weka running across the front lawn, and it's wonderful. They're great birds. But do they have a place on an island like Rakatu that has enormous potential? So that's me. I believe seabirds are worth shouting about. I keep doing it. Ngā nui. Thank you. Ka pai.
Kia ora koutou, ko Izzy taku ingoa. So we're staying on the Seabird theme. Sorry, so bear with me, but they are really awesome. I'm going to be giving a short talk about just one of the really significant impacts on our seabirds that is a new challenge that we need to try and address. I'm going to talk a bit about marine heat waves, what they are, the impacts on seabirds, and then talk about a bit of the research that I did as part of my master's and a thesis that I did just hand in a week ago. So it's quite fresh. Before I start the presentation though, I would just like to, acknowledge the amazing, wonderful seabirds all around the Hauraki Gulf, Te Kapumoana, Te Moana Nui Otoi, and the amazing motu that I had the privilege of working on and the mana whenua of those islands. Thank you. And hopefully this research and everything will help inform a lot of the future conservation efforts that do need to happen for our really important seabirds. So marine heat waves. What is a marine heat wave? So a marine heat wave is when we have enormously high sea surface temperatures. So a sea surface temperature that is not within the normal range that it should be. And that happens for a consecutive amount of days. And if it kind of goes on for a prolonged period of time, then it's classified as a marine heat wave. The problem is that they are increasing in frequency and duration and intensity, particularly in the Hauraki Gulf, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this means that there's a shifting baseline of what actually defines a marine heat wave. And the conditions that we have now compared to 100 years ago, everything would be classified as a marine heat wave. So it's a little bit tricky nowadays with the how quickly they're increasing. So this is data from 1967 to at the moment, and you can see over the last 10 years that really stark increase in sea surface temperature. I know it's only about 1 degree to 2 degrees warmer, and to you guys, you might think it's not that much. But for zooplankton, for example, that's the difference between life and death. You think if we got a temperature, if we are a degree hotter, that's pretty serious, right? And we could die. Same with what's out there in the oceans, okay? So in 2022, we had marine heatwave conditions for 313 days of the year, which is massive and really, really, really scary, which means everything that depends on the ocean, including our seabirds, are obviously going to be struggling, to say the least. So this is some of the data that I analysed for a chick growth study on diving petrel, which I'll talk a bit about later. But you can see that actually my field season, the 2025 season, coincided with a marine heatwave. So yes, we are currently in marine heatwave conditions. It's really scary. And I had actually measured some of those impacts on diving petrel this year. Last year, but this season. So what makes seabirds so vulnerable to marine heat waves? Firstly, seabirds are already under threat from, land and at sea. We talk about fishing pressures, obviously predators, and so on. Already our species are 90 to 95% of them are threatened or threatened with extinction, and that's been touched on quite a lot. But they have a really unique breeding ecology. So they typically, all seabird species will only produce one chick per year. So they've got one go at breeding for the year. And if something happens with the parents, then they are what we call prudent parents. So if their body condition declines enough, then they will essentially either forego breeding. So they will abandon their egg if they have laid an egg. Or if the chick has already hatched, they will abandon that chick in order to preserve themselves and just reattempt breeding next year. So if they've only got one go once a year, that places them at a really critical tipping point in terms of population viability and structure. If, say, every year they're getting disturbed by marine heat waves or, predators, then that's really not going to be very good. Their reliance on patchily distributed prey resources in the ocean, they have to forage across oceans for days, sometimes weeks at a time, to find enough food to not only feed themselves, but their chicks. And so that makes them also really quite vulnerable to marine heat waves. So what are the impacts of marine heat waves on seabirds and the wider marine ecosystem? So firstly, I'm going to talk a bit about the actual physical changes to the ocean and then how that impacts prey, so zooplankton and little foraging fish, which are predominantly what a lot of our seabird species feed on. For diving petrel, which I'll talk more in depth about, they feed pretty much solely on zooplankton. So when a marine heatwave happens, obviously it gets warmer. That's kind of doesn't need to be said. But we get a decrease in primary productivity. So there's not as much phytoplankton, which in turn the zooplankton feed on, which in turn the fish feed on the zooplankton. And so there's just not enough food for everyone, essentially. So what we get is a decrease, in that biomass of zooplankton or those fish. And we also get changes in the community structure of zooplankton or fish. So we often see those prey species that can tolerate heat a little bit better, but are actually not as nutritional for our seabirds or our, other marine megafauna. So they're actually having to work harder in order to capture prey, but also the prey that they are getting is not as nutritious, which leads me into my next bit about adult response to marine heat waves. So as I was saying, they might have to work harder, so they might have to extend their foraging trips during breeding to get enough food for themselves and their chicks. So they may have to dive deeper, dive more often, fly further, and ultimately they're having to expend more energy to do that for less reward. And this obviously increases stress in the birds. And if they become stressed enough and their body condition declines enough, then those impacts are seen for our cute little chicks, or for if they're incubating, the abandonment of eggs. So depending on what stage of the breeding season these seabirds are at, they will abandon their eggs or their chicks in order to preserve themselves and just reattempt breeding next year. And I'll talk a little bit more about those impacts for my research a little bit later. But ultimately, marine heat waves, if they happen, it's going to manifest first in the chicks, in the breeding success of a population. And if it is really severe and the adults aren't able to respond, whether that's, through foraging harder or capturing, prey at deeper depths, if they're still not able to do that and their body condition declines enough, then we get mass mortalities. The Northern Hemisphere, there's been a lot of studies that have been done, and they've witnessed, mass die-offs in the millions of seabirds from a single marine heat wave. So, really, really scary and big problem. And so these two parts here that are highlighted in red is what I was really interested in being able to measure and quantify to firstly assess how seabirds are actually going to respond to marine heat waves. So I wanted to develop methods that I could actually measure this. And then also start collecting data on the breeding success of diving petrel chicks on Tiritiri Mātangi Island for the first time, so that we could kind of build a baseline for what is the normal versus what is not the normal. So how can we measure these impacts on seabirds? And this is where my research that I have just completed comes in to try and address that question. So, as I have said, I had the absolute privilege of working out at the Mokahino Islands and Tiritiri Mātangi Island. And my study species is diving petrel, who have a very special place in my heart. They've got bright blue legs, they're teeny little guys, and they have the cutest kind of purring call. If you've ever heard them, they're absolutely gorgeous. So they were the study species that I kind of developed these methods on, and hopefully in the future, this can be done on a lot of our other seabirds out in the Hauraki Gulf to see how they might respond, because one species may not respond to a marine heat wave the same way that these guys might. So it's really important that we, do it on a species by species basis. So this is just another photo of the Mokahino Islands, and it is just, I cannot begin to describe how incredible of a place it is to someone who is a seabird ecologist to work out there. It's remarkable at night, the amount of noise and seabirds flying overhead and seabirds flying into you as well is quite awesome. So working with seabirds, it can be quite tiring sometimes because you are working at night because the adults only come back to the burrows at night. We mostly work in red light to not disturb the birds. So that's me there tagging a grey-faced petrel, actually, not a diving petrel. They have super-duper cute chicks that they leave in the burrows overnight. That's me reaching my arm down trying to get an adult out. But the chicks hang out in the burrow throughout the day. And they nest in really tricky places to access often. So that's reddish just along there, and up where that arrow is pointing is a whole bunch of different seabird different seabird species nesting. And the two photos at the top, this is when I was doing one of my studies on the Mokahino Islands, and we're putting a tag on the back of the bird, which I'll talk about the data that produced, and also taking blood samples that could tell us about their energy expenditure. So my research was to try and develop those methods so we could quantify, firstly, foraging behaviour at sea. So how do they allocate their time to different behaviours at sea? So how much are they diving? How much are they flying? And once we know that, then we can assess how that might change in response to a marine heat wave. And then the second kind of part of my research focused, as I said, on that breeding success. kind of the population specifically on Tiritimatangi. This is me taking a blood sample from a little diving petrel, and through, again, some really complex techniques, I'm able to assess how much energy they're actually expending throughout the day and kind of correlate that with some of the tagging stuff we did before to see how costly those behaviours are for seabirds. And our tags also allowed us to track where these birds are actually foraging. So the red triangle in the middle is the mokahinos. That's where the breeding colony is. Aotea is just there. And yeah, they clearly do not actually go very far from their colony. Unlike other seabirds that'll go for 2 weeks, these guys like to stay really locally, which makes them a really, really important indicator species of local marine conditions for a certain area. So this species might actually be able to tell us the state of an entire marine ecosystem in a local context. And I'll talk a little bit about that shortly as well. So why does this research matter? Well, it helps through measuring chicks, assessing the behaviour at sea, and the energetics associated with that. It can identify when there's some early warning signals that these seabirds are under stress and are feeling the impacts of marine heat waves. As I said, diving petrels, because they forage so locally, they can be a really important tool and indicator species of marine conditions. So is a marine heat wave happening, and how might that be impacting throughout the food web all the way through to, whales and dolphins and things like that. And yeah, we can, through these methods, assess the different responses seabirds might have and inform important conservation management and targeted action, and just ultimately build that clearer picture of how marine heat waves might shape seabird populations in the future. So what can we do? I know it's all a bit doom and gloom, but what can we do to try and help these seabirds deal with the consequences of marine heat waves? So the first is really obvious: try and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere, although that's proving very difficult to coordinate any political party, politicians, at the global scale, local scale. It's a hot topic, but ultimately that's what we need to do, right? So even something really small, just at home, turn those lights off. I don't know, choose to walk, bike, adds up. Local actions. The first is to protect the food sources of our seabirds. So address the overfishing issue that we have, particularly in the Aotea Gulf. We're taking all their food and they've got nothing left. So if we can try and help relieve a lot of that pressure, then it gives them more buffering capacity to be able to deal with those heatwave impacts. Reduce the sediment, nutrient runoff, that's causing those problems that Chris kind of talked about. But also protecting our really important biogenic habitats, so our kelp forests, our seagrass meadows that have the ability to sequester carbon. So take that carbon and absorb it, out of the atmosphere and try again buffer those impacts of marine heat waves. And then community action, support marine reserves. They have been shown and demonstrated to, be far more resilient and produce, an incredible array of biodiversity just in a small area. And monitoring programs, local monitoring programs such as with breeding of populations of seabirds to see how are they doing, and we can assess that, and participate in citizen science surveys. Really super simple. The Trust, we ran a citizen science project this year for TT, Cook's Petrel. We actually did a few reports from Aotea, which was really cool, of people hearing them flying over at night to build an understanding of where these seabirds are, how they're flying over land, how they're using it, so that we can inform important, spatial planning in the future and things like that. So, final message, almost there. marine heat waves are increasing in intensity, duration, frequency, and they're becoming a really, really big problem that we need to address as soon as possible. But there is hope. If we can remove all those other, pressures from predators and from the overfishing, if we can remove those and they just have to deal with those marine heat wave pressures, that allows them a lot more wiggle room and more buffering capacity. And that can be done at the global scale. It can be done at the local scale, and with a lot of community support, and all the projects that you guys are running and are a part of really, really do help make a difference. And so they're really, really important, and we can actually do a lot to reduce the impacts that these seabirds feel. That is all from me. This is a beautiful photo out again at the Makahina Islands at night, walking back from the seabird colony. But yeah, thank you for listening. Ngā mihi nui. I appreciate it.
Good.